Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva, and I've been doing live streams most recently about the importance of the Holy Spirit in the lives of Christians. Today is part 2 of a new series that we started last week called The Seven Spirits of Revelation. So let's go ahead and get started. So the title of today's episode is Symbols and More Symbols. As you are probably familiar with if you've read the book of Revelation or even read just parts of the book of Revelation, it is full of symbolism. Last week we talked about some of the symbols, but we started out talking about how or when the book of Revelation might have been written. And really there are two dates that come to mind, or that theologians and scholars believe in. The earlier one is 64 AD to 68 AD. And the second one is 95 AD to 96 AD, the later one. Now, I am accepting or going with, I guess is how you could say it, the later one, 95 to 96 AD. You really do have to make a choice, because right from the get-go, it will affect how you interpret the book of Revelation. If you choose the earlier date, then most importantly, that predates the destruction of the temple. And then a lot of the things that John might be depicting have to do with the destruction of the temple and the first Jewish-Roman war. If Revelation was written after that, so that would be over 20 years after 70 AD and 95 or 96 AD, then of course the temple has been destroyed. It's in ruins already. And then you have to say, well, then what is Jesus trying to tell John, since the temple has already been destroyed? So it's important to go with one. I'm going with the later one, not because it makes things easier. I don't know if it makes things easier or harder, but I'm going with the later one because of firstly, it's because of its support by early Christian writers. So we talked last week about Irenaeus, Petau, and Eusebius. They all talk about John being in exile on the Isle of Patmos under the rule of Domitian. And Domitian was the emperor. He was killed in 96 AD, and so that would have been the time of Domitian. If it was the earlier date, it would have been Nero. Now, Nero and Domitian share a lot of attributes in terms of being horrific, tyrannical rulers, but they are different types of tyranny, I guess you could say. Nero was, I guess you could just say he was crazy. He was a psychopath. And, somebody like him obviously shouldn't get power of an entire empire like Rome. I guess you could argue that with all of the emperors, but Nero specifically was very crazy. Domitian, on the other hand, there are some of the aspects of the symbolism and the story of Revelation do point more towards Domitian, which is the second reason why I'm going with that later date. Those would be the economic sanctions. So the idea that the people who are being persecuted are partly one form of that persecution comes from not being able to buy and sell. And that was not something that Nero was known for. That was something that Domitian was known for. And then the other aspect is Nero seemed to be obsessed with his own beauty, his own humanity, but not from a divine or deity theistic type of viewpoint. Whereas Domitian was more like a Julius Caesar, much more like a archetypal leader of a dynasty that wants to be viewed as divine or as a god or a demagogue. So that we'll see that you do see that in the book of Revelation, and so that's another reason why Domitian fits for that. Probably the best argument for the early writing has to do with the measuring of the temple in Revelation 11. But that's a very tenuous argument to hold on to, as the whole of Revelation is a vision and a dream. And although perhaps Jesus or an angel actually was taking John from one physical place to another, more likely he was having a vision as he was deep in meditation in the Spirit, is how John put it. He was in the Spirit on the day of the Lord. And so the obviously God could, if you can make this amazing image, this amazing basically movie that John is in, with all of the various symbols and the four horsemen and all that, then he could clearly put a temple in there as well for him to go up to and measure. He doesn't have to measure it a physical temple. And that's what a lot of people kind of hang on to for the earlier interpretation, the earlier writing date of Revelation, that if John's going up to the temple and measuring things, then he clearly must excuse me, it clearly must be before the destruction of the temple. But I don't buy that. I see it as part of the vision. I mean, even just the idea of walking along the sides of the temple with a stick, you don't need a real temple for that. That is something that could be done in the vision. Okay, now we also talked about the 3 parts of Revelation, how it has structured in three different sections. You have and that's not counting the prelogue, but I guess you could say 4 if you count the prelogue. But you have this introduction of the vision with Christ and his amazing imagery of Jesus in white and fire and gold. Then you have a less symbolic, more literal, but still symbolic, the 7 churches. That's in Revelation 2 and 3. And then the rest of Revelation, most of Revelation from 4 to 22, is this amazing vision that John was given. What we will see today is that identifying, defining, and setting limits on the symbols in the book of Revelation, these apocalyptic style symbols, is very important. And very rarely is a symbol both symbolic and literal. It's not, I shouldn't say not never, that's a lot of negatives. There definitely are cases where it's both symbolic and literal. If you think of the 7 days of the week, there are actually 7 days of the week, but they are based on the symbolic number of 7, representing the number of days that God spent creating the heavens and earth and then resting on the 7th day. If you think about the 7 churches in the book of Revelation, those are 7 real churches that were real at that time. So that is a literal thing. And even the messages to those 7 churches is very literal insofar as those are probably real issues that the churches were going through at that time. But then it's also symbolic because the number 7 is divine completeness, divine fulfillment. And so it can represent the whole church, both then and in the future, the whole all of Christ's church. Now, what about, for instance, the number 144,000? So that is without a doubt symbolic. It's composed of the number 12, which is the religious number coming from the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles. And you see that added up together, you get the 24, number 24, like the 24 elders that you see in the book of Revelation, and then the number 1,000. And yeah, so that's definitely symbolic, but is it also literal? Is it also the case that there are going to be 144,000 occupants of the new Jerusalem that comes down from the heavens? I personally don't think so, but for instance, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they do believe that that is a literal number. I'm not sure if they see the symbolic side as well. I would assume they do. But whenever you start treating these symbols as both symbolic and literal, then you can definitely run into some trouble. And so that is why it is a good case that we should spend some time talking about these different symbols. Some of these symbols are very generic. You find them throughout apocalyptic literature, Jewish literature, and others of them, a few of them, are very specific to the book of Revelation. But if you don't understand, define, recognize these symbols, then it's very easy for your interpretation of Revelation to go askew. So the numeric symbols of Revelation. I have highlighted two, the number 3.5 and the number 7. You could also highlight the number 4 and the number 1,000, 666, of course, is important, and 144,000. You will find all of these numbers in the book of Revelation, but you will find not just them used more than once. The number 3.5 and the number 7 is used the most often. And that is important to keep in mind, that it means fullness, completeness, and divine order. So another reason why it's important to keep track of those symbols is because there's overlap of these symbols with the book of Daniel, also the book of Ezekiel. There's some in Zechariah, Matthew 24. So it's important to keep that in mind. So these are these symbols that are numeric that you will find in the book of Revelation. And as we go through these tables, you'll see this rightmost column. For the most part, I've only chosen to talk about symbols that are either a broad consensus among theologians and scholars, or that are commonly accepted, but there may be some debate as to what the exact meaning is. The second set of symbols that we're going to talk about are what I call the cosmic symbols of Revelation. And some of them are also used in other places as well. So this first one, the sun and the moon and the stars. And I suppose you could also put comets or asteroids or stars falling from the sky as they're all symbolic. They, maybe at times might have been literal in the different uses within apocalyptic style. You can think of like the moon turning red. It does turn red when there is a lunar eclipse, but lunar eclipses are quite frequent. And so, if they're once every 1,000 years, then you could say, hey, the moon will turn red. And then when the moon turns red, everybody will freak out. Even eclipses of the sun, the darkening of the sun, that happens a couple times a year, but maybe more rarely, especially as in the equatorial regions. Nevertheless, even though they did happen from time to time, the stars falling and the sun being darkened and the moon being turned to red, they all have this theocratic imperial collapse. the end of an age, a cosmic scale judgment. The sky is falling in a spiritual sense, type of sense to them. If we look at 1, Acts chapter 2, Peter refers to the book of Joel, and he quotes the whole thing, but I'll start in verse 20 of Acts chapter 2. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. Some people will say that that actually occurred when Jesus was killed on the cross. There was darkness. When Jesus rose from the dead, there was an earthquake, and perhaps there was a lunar eclipse in that time period. Who knows? But the main idea is, even without those things literally happening, those appearing in apocalyptic style writing means that there's a great cosmic scale judgment and transition occurring. And we talked a little bit about earthquakes. So there was, the Bible says the earth shook when he died and when he rose from the dead. And those appear to be actual literal earthquakes that took place. But it's because of the damage and the power of earthquakes that it is used as a symbol as well. And so it means theophany, which is whenever a divine figure appears to a man, it's called theophany. And it also refers to great judgment. So then you'll also see these cosmic symbols of hail, fire, smoke, sulfur, the burning of things. Those harken back to the plagues of the Exodus, and they also refer to divine instances of judgment. There's judgment usually comes in, you can think of it as waves or cycles. It's not just a constant thing, but it's like a certain level of sin or something builds up and then bam, there's something that happens. So you see that in this third column, by the way, is references. A lot of the references are to in the book of Revelation, of course, but also I put some notes about where you might find them in other places in the Bible. The 4 winds, the 4 beasts, the 4 living beings. So number 4 has this idea of having a universal or cosmic scope, or the whole world or the whole known world type of a scope. And that comes from the idea of having the 4 directions of north, east, south, and west. And so the 4 winds that you see in the book of Revelation, the wind is a symbol of something being carried. So some sort of either information or some sort of judgment that's being carried. And if it's going in all 4 directions, then it's a universal scope of judgment. The sea, you'll see things that are hurled into the sea, or it'll say rising up from the sea. This often refers to the sea of humanity. So you could think of the sea as just all of these people throughout the earth. And every once in a while, there will be a leader who will rise up. And that will, that could be the symbolism that could be used is that there was a horn. We'll talk about a horn later, but a horn that rose up out of the sea. Or something like a comet or a star is hurled into the sea. That means it was judgment was thrown into the sea of humanity, and it causes things like chaos and panic throughout the world. You'll also see abyss and the deep, and this was an apocalyptic style for being a prison of demonic powers. The mountain we've talked about in the series on the kingdom, that the mountain stood for kingdoms or temples or this divine presence of God amongst people. So the temple was built on a mountain, and Israel was symbolized by Mount Zion. You can think about Jesus saying that if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can throw this mountain into the sea. And so that actually is very symbolic. A lot of people are wondering why nobody's throwing mountains into seas. Everybody must have no faith. But the idea is that you can throw some sort of, I believe in that particular case, I think it's Matthew 12, that Jesus is talking about having faith to throw the old covenant, the ways of the old covenant, the era of the old covenant, or the age of the old covenant, into the sea of humanity and into the, I don't want to use the word trash, but into the abyss. But you will see the mountain in the book of Revelation towards the end, also, and then Daniel 2, Isaiah 2 as well. Okay, so the next set are, I call them the priestly or temple or worship symbols. You'll see this, the altar and incense. Those are general symbols in apocalyptic style, so not just Revelation, to prayers. The idea of incense, a lot of these you'll see, that's why I put worship symbols, is they were used at the temple. And so whatever purpose they had at the temple, then you can extend that to whatever its symbol might mean. So the priests would have these containers that had burning incense in them, and so you would, move them from side to side and get that smell. I don't really like the smell of incense for the most part, but apparently, for a lot of people, it's a good thing. But it was definitely associated with worship at the temple. So, and the altar definitely was a big part of the temple where sacrifices were made. And so the idea here is that it's prayers rising, or priestly intercession. So you have the Ark of the Covenant and then the temple itself. Those represent where God is, or where his covenant resides with God's people up until 70 AD. Lampstands, you can see that with the churches, the 7 churches. It shows, as a imagery, it shows Jesus, it talks about Jesus walking amongst the 7 lampstands. And those are seen as, specifically in Revelation, as a symbol of, or an extension to the symbol, the idea of Christian churches. Churches as temple lights, as lights in the temple. White robes, that comes from first of all, the symbol white, which we'll talk about in a second, which has to do with purity. But when someone is clothed with a robe, that means that a prize, a reward has been given to them. And so if you get a white robe in heaven, that's a good thing. That's vindication for you. That's purity, or maybe the reward for martyrdom. You will see crowns. When someone puts a crown on you, it's very similar as to getting a robe put on you. You get a crown put on you. That is a reward, or can also mean that God has given somebody authority. You'll see the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls. That has to do with this idea of what I call phased judgments. It comes from the liturgical cadence. So in the liturgy of the temple, you would have different steps that you would go through with things like incense and music, trumpets, and so forth. And so in the book of Revelation, that has to do with judgments going out in different steps, not all at once, but in these different phases. All right, now there are a lot of creatures and what I call composite beasts. So the beasts that are made up of different types of animals. You can definitely see that a lot in the book of Daniel. And if you're thinking about it in a literal sense, then it's very strange to have, 4 living beings that have multiple heads and eyes all over them and things like that. You get this really weird picture in your mind of what is this thing that we're talking about. But it is a symbol, and all those different things on the beast, the various types of beasts, and the things like wings or claws or teeth or eyes all over it, those are all symbolic of the powers of whatever that creature is symbolizing. So in the book of Revelation specifically, you see the beast from the sea. So here we talk about a rising power, the current empire that is on the earth at the moment, because it's the one that has most recently come out of the sea of humanity to organize itself as the authority over all the other humans. You also will see beast from the earth, or what is also called the false prophet. That is symbolic of this cultic choice of worship that a person at that time would have to, or in the future, would have to make. They either choose to worship God, and maybe they will lose their life or lose property or lose certain rights, or they can worship God, in which case they may get, I'm not sure if I said that right before, but you have this choice. You can either worship God or you can worship the emperor. And that would be this cultic idea, and also propaganda that the emperors and kings, that rulers of that time would put out, that they are the deities, or they are demigods, part God. And this idea of a false prophet can also be symbolic of deceptive religion, or a type of religion that gets in and perniciously lies and twists the truth. So the dragon is a very prominent figure in the book of Revelation chapter 12, and that often refers to Satan, or whatever the prime spiritual adversary of God happens to be. We talked a little bit about horns earlier. In the book of Daniel, you see creatures that have 10 horns, and then sometimes one of the horns will sprout 3 horns, and you're like, what is going on with this imagery? You have a horn, and how does it spout 3 new horns? The horns are representative of kings and emperors. And so if you have, like in the book of Revelation, a single horn that splits into 3, that means that one emperor will be killed and replaced by 3 maybe generals that are fighting or squabbling for power. Or maybe they divide the kingdom up, and each of them has a certain section of it, or something. That would be an example of how the symbol of horns is used. Eyes have to do with knowledge, omniscience, perception, the ability to know things. And so we all have 2 eyes, but if a creature is covered with eyes, or has eyes all over its wings or something, that means that it sees all. So you see these creatures, the lion, the leopard, and the bear, in Revelation, but also, in Daniel chapter 7, but then reused in Revelation 13, which could indicate an overlap between what Daniel is talking about and what Revelation is talking about. Or, since both Revelation and Daniel are written using the apocalyptic style, it could just mean that they are reusing the symbolism. So you have to look at that as we get to it. But we can at least limit these types of animals to features of successive empires. So for instance, in Daniel, the leopard was leapt from west to east without its feet touching the ground. That was referring to Alexander the Great, and how his empire just went at this, almost as fast as an army can move from west to east, just devouring all of the nations and taking control of all of the nations as it went. Locusts are probably one of the most interesting aspects in the book of Revelation, and a lot of people, especially dispensationalists, end timers, will associate helicopters with locusts. And I definitely can see that association. There is, if there's a large swarm of locusts coming, and you can also hear helicopters coming from the distance, even just the look, and so it describes some of these in the book of Revelation as locusts. Was God giving a symbol to John, and John could just write it down, and however he saw it, he's like, I don't know what this thing is, but it looks kind of like a locust, and it's flying, and locusts fly. It sounds kind of like a locust. That's a possibility. But in the apocalyptic literature, apocalyptic style, locust also harken back to the plagues of Israel and represented a plague or demonic invasion, judgment coming upon somebody or something. So yeah, you have to keep a rein, tight control over locusts. Eagle is swiftness, judgment, a herald of things. Sometimes they will speak. We do see the lamb. It describes him as slain yet standing. So this messianic figure that was injured, that was killed on earth, but then was risen again. So there are the four horses. There's the white horse, the red horse, the black horse, and the pale horse. And horse is itself symbolic of the the cavalry, the motion of the implements of the transport of the implements of war, people and weaponry and so forth. And then the colors, white refers to purity or victory. Scarlet has to do with blood, or sometimes associated with luxury, or the black was representative of famines, and pale or greenish pale, kind of an icky green if you think about it, is representative of decay and death. And so when you put all those colors onto a horse, then that's the type of horse that you will get. A white horse is a conquest, a spiritual conquest, perhaps the advance of the gospel. That one is debated. Or the red horse is war coming and being brought to different places. Black horse can be associated with not just famines for the color black, but also economic sanctions. And then pale death can have to do with, the pale horse can deal with plagues or sicknesses, epidemics. Well, the idea of a scroll is very general to apocalyptic style, but these different types of scrolls or seals, also a seal was used. Seal in general was shows divine ownership, that God himself has taken control of something and sealed it. But seal on a forehead then can talk about divine ownership or protection. The mark of the beast has to do with whose allegiance you have chosen. You've chosen to take this, even if it was forced on you, but you chose not to die or be killed because of your faith. Then that would mean that you have given over control to whatever, or allegiance to whatever the emperor is. There's books, the book of life, or it could also be a scroll. There actually was two different Greek words for that, for a book and for a scroll. Biblos is the word for scroll. I'm not sure what the word is for book. But in Jewish culture, the book was kept at the temple, and it was a historical record. It wasn't a scroll, it was a book, and it was a historical record of the people of Israel and their ancestry. So you see a scroll or a book uses a symbol, then that can be the idea of a divine registry of the redeemed. So those people who are saved are in the book of life. There's a little scroll that's in the book of Revelation, and it was bittersweet when he ate it. So the scroll itself is a symbolic of a message going out, a word going out, because that is how the word of God was stored in the temple on scrolls. There in Revelation 5, there's a scroll that's written on both sides. That refers to then a message which is a complete message, and most likely it would indicate that it's already been fulfilled. And then there's the idea of getting a new name. That happens literally in different cases in the Bible, but from a symbolic standpoint, it talks about being transformed, getting a new identity or new ownership, maybe now owned by God instead of owned by the emperor. Or if you get the mark of the beast, now you are owned by the emperor. There are a lot of geographic symbols and objects in the book of Revelation. I'll leave this scroll up. I'll leave this table up so you can look at it. But ones that are very symbolic. Babylon was very symbolic of the world system of idolatry. And Babylon was, the memory of Babylon was the destruction and exile of Judea. And so that is what this symbol means, not specifically of Jerusalem, but of God's people. Jerusalem is used a couple different ways, and it happens to be the literal city of God at that time of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, but then it can be the city of God in heaven or somewhere else in a future time. Let me skip over some of these. You'll see a sword coming out of the mouth. You also see that in Ephesians 6. But that has to do, a sword coming out of the mouth is the judicial word of Christ, or the judgment of Christ coming out. Keys, you'll see keys like in Matthew 16. Keys you use to open and close things. And so when someone is given keys in a vision of some sort, that is referring to them getting authority to start something or open something or close it. Measuring rod or reed has to do with preservation or judgment boundary. And so oftentimes God will say, this plague will happen, but it won't go any further than this. It's kind of a limiting where the judgment is going to go out, or how far or how long the judgment will go on. These time labels. So you have the day of the Lord. You also see this word soon or near or quickly used. And you also see these what are called chiasms, which are just images or mirrored types of words or images. And a recapitulation is... it refers, in this case, to starting with this symbol, it has to do with cycles. So if you see the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls, a lot of scholars see that as referring to the cyclic nature of humanity. The soon and near and quick can be, we talked about a little bit last week, but it's difficult to put a time limit on that, since soon might mean a week for us, but it might mean 1,000 years for God. And so it's difficult if you say soon, but there actually are a lot of references to things happening soon or near or quickly in the book of Revelation. And so it's important to try to understand and put a limit on that as to what that symbol might mean. On the day of the Lord, a lot of times people think that is the end of time or something, but actually, just in general, a day of the Lord is a climactic judgment or visitation from God. You'll see that both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Thanks again for tuning in and joining me today. Hopefully you got some interest out of these different symbols. As we go forward in the future, in the upcoming episodes, when we talk about Revelation, I will be going back to those tables quite often to refer to what this symbol might mean and try to limit the scope of how it can impact the interpretation of whatever passage we're talking about. Next week, we'll talk about the Revelation chapter 2 and 3 about the 7 churches and the letters that were written to the 7 churches. That should be interesting. Remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends, and have a great evening.